Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Dinyar Patel, and we are launching his brand new book called Naoroji, published by the Harvard University Press and represented by Harper Collins. Dinyar, would you like to unveil? I think you don't have a. I'm going to tear open this paper.
Absolutely, go ahead. Mine is unwrapped, but
So why don't you show it to us?
sure. Here it is.
There it is. So here is Naoroji. It looks really beautiful.
Thank you.
Dinyar. And this is a collaboration between ThePrint and Harper Collins, which is representing Harvard University Press, your publisher. And this is an online collaboration that ThePrint has, launching several books. So congratulations to this. And I'm sure everybody who's watching this program, especially students, will learn a lot from this, as I did. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, my first question to you, Dinyar, is about the book itself, and I will ask you later why you wrote it. But first, tell me, why should I read about Dadabhai Naoroji? It's been more than 100 years, 1917 that he passed away. So why should I care 100 years later?
That's a very good question. And, I think that question can be applied to his entire generation of Indian nationalists. Nowadays, when we think of the independence movement or nationalism, of course, we think of people like Gandhi or Nehru or Patel or Ambedkar and such. But we need to remember that they did not come from anywhere, right? And they themselves acknowledged their roots. And the reason why people like Naoroji are important to understand is because they were pretty much at the very creation of nationalism. They were there at the moment that, dispersed critiques of colonialism around India combined together into something that was organized, something with stated political demands, something that started to talk about stuff like Swaraj and independence when the British, empire was at its very height. So in many ways, it's a story for understanding roots of how modern India is today. Many of the values that we'd like to think India represents, or India does represent, have their very start and are first enunciated by people in Naoroji's generation.
So you say that he was there right at the beginning, in 1886. In fact, when the Indian National Congress was born, it was Naoroji who co-founded the Congress along with Surendra, Nath, Bonnerjea, and Allan, Octavian, Hume. Now, and you yourself, you're Parsi, I imagine of Parsi origin at least. You're American by citizenship or your passport, and just a quick introduction which I didn't make before. You're back in Mumbai and are going to start teaching at the SP Jain School of Management, if I'm not wrong.
Correct.
What made you write this book? I mean, you're Parsi, but was there a Parsi connection to this?
I mean, obviously, it played a little bit of a role. I mean, you're understanding one's own heritage and history. But, Naoroji was obviously not just a Parsi, right? He was someone who, described himself as an Indian first. And again, he was of that generation, the first generation really to identify as, by the nationality before anything else. And the reason why I decided to start this project, which, it's taken 10 years,
10 years.
Or worse. It started as a PhD in my graduate program. The reason why I decided to write on this topic was because so little historical work has been done on Naoroji and his generation. The last good book on Dadabhai Naoroji, the last comprehensive biography, was written in 1939. So many decades ago in completely different political context. When you look at the lay of the field of Indian history, first of all, there's so few biographies. We know very little about the important individuals who are key to understanding aspects of Indian history. And again, his particular generation of so-called moderate nationalists or liberal nationalists is pretty much entirely forgotten, right, in the popular imagination. We know about Gokhale, we know about Naoroji, we know about one or two other individuals, but we don't really know what they did. And so what I wanted to do was write about who Naoroji was beyond the two sentence narrative we all know: drain theory, member of parliament.
Yeah, but all these sort of nuggets that come down to us in school and college and things. And the first is that he's a grand old man of India. He was the first Indian who was elected to the British Parliament in 1892. But his life is quite interesting because when he is born in 1825, this is 25 years before the 1857 First War of Independence, which means that the sweep of his life is pre-1857 and how the British would have, how the British changed from the East India Company to the empire. So tell us a little bit about his early years and how then he sort of, he matures into becoming this very interesting politician.
Sure. So just the sheer length of his life is one reason why he's so important. As you pointed out, he was born in 1825, and just a few years before 1825, the Maratha power was extinguished, right? So, just a few years beforehand, a little over 2 decades before he is born, Delhi is captured by the British, right? So this is, again, the very beginning of, the subcontinent-wide British domination of India. And when he dies in 1917, it's only a few years before Gandhi launches non-cooperation. So it's a huge span of time. But before 1857, his career is centered in Bombay. He eventually spends a good chunk of his adult life in London, but prior to 1855, when he leaves for London for the first time, it's spent in Bombay, and he plays a role in developing the social, political infrastructure in the city of Bombay, which at that point in time is just emerging as an important center in its own right. So he's part of something called Young Bombay, which is similar to, say, Young Bengal, which took place in Bengal in the 1820s or so. And it's similar in the sense that it's talking about reform. Indians have imbibed certain Western ideas from the Enlightenment and thereafter, and they're trying to apply it to their environment around them. So, Young Bombay was about the spread of education. It was about educating women. It was about reforming religious practice. And it's also about the beginnings of political organization. So one of Naoroji's, arguably Naoroji's most significant activity in this era is starting female education on a large scale in Bombay. Because, again, prior to this era, most Indian women would not have got any form of education whatsoever, or they would have been educated in the home. Naoroji and several of his students and professors at Elphinstone College, where he taught, start a network of girls' schools for Indians. And it starts off in a very unpromising manner, right? And most Indian fathers are distraught at the idea of sending their daughters to school. But again, through perseverance, they're able to make it work. And by the time he leaves in 1855, several hundred Indian students are on.
But are these Indians also from, say, the Hindu community, the Marathas, or are they sort of mostly Anglo-Indian or, from, say, the Parsi community, which has always been sort of far more progressive and ahead of its time in many ways?
So in this era, when Naoroji starts these schools, there are 3 networks that are specifically started. One for Parsi girls, one for Hindu Gujarati girls, and one for Hindu Maharashtrian girls. So they're separate, and largely it's because of linguistic differences. But eventually other communities come on board, Muslims, others as well.
Okay, so then he's very much part of this elite in Bombay, if you like. And so tell us a little bit about how he transforms himself into becoming the foremost Indian nationalist.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of that has to do with his experience abroad, outside of India. So as I said, he left for Great Britain in 1855, and for roughly the next 5 to 6 decades, he's living for a good chunk of his time in Great Britain. And while he's in Great Britain and Europe, he realizes the vast difference between the richness of a place like London or Liverpool or Paris and the poverty that surrounds Bombay in India. So that, kind of that germ of an idea that why is India so poor really kind of kickstarts his political career. Why is India impoverished? Why is the situation not getting any better? Why are there these mass famines going on throughout the country? So it's actually being out of India that really, I think, gets him very interested in
so what does he find then? What are the answers that he finds?
Yeah. So, his most important economic legacy is, he took economic data that the British had compiled on the economic condition of India, and he refuted a lot of it. He showed that it was inconsistent, that in fact India was a far poorer country than the official data made it seem. So, I mean, his biggest legacy in this case is showing that Indians were literally living on the verge of starvation. And the reason why so many Indians died from famine was because they were already earning just enough to buy enough food. So if some small thing happened, like a natural disaster, failure of the monsoons, that's why you had mass famines where millions of people died.
So not very much has changed, but this theory that he talks about is called the drain of wealth. This phrase that we read about, this drain of wealth. So what does this really mean?
Well, it's the idea that prior to British rule, no matter who conquered India, be it the Mughals, be it competing Hindu dynasties in different parts of India, no one took the wealth outside of the country, right? I mean, it was redistributed. Some people got rich, some people got poor. But the thing that separated European colonialism from all these previous political systems was that here, for the first time, you have the wealth of India literally being sucked out of the country and being used to enrich another country. Right? I mean, it's like a perpetual raid or a perpetual ransacking. And he calculated that every year about 33 million pounds was taken out of India into British coffers, which doesn't sound like a lot nowadays, but was a lot back in that day.
How much do you think it would have been worth today, 33 million pounds in 2020?
I would not know off the top of my head, but various estimates have been given as to how much money India lost under colonialism, and it could be on the scale of trillions. I mean, a very telling statistic, economic statistic, is that before British rule, India controlled about 20 to 25% of the world GDP, right? The economic output, and by the time of Indian independence, it's down to around 5%, right? So you have a dramatic change in economic conditions in India.
But here are the British who also introduce a lot of institutions that are very good for India. And I'm not talking just about the railways, but the ending of female infanticide, female education. So there are a lot of progressive things that the British also do.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing history teaches you is nothing is black or white, right? I mean, there are various shades of gray. And, when I began working on Naoroji, I was asking these same questions. Did British rule do something that was, good? Was it better in some aspects that the British were there rather than other colonial powers? And, by the end of working on this project, you really come to the conclusion that, there was a certain idea of what the British like to project themselves of as imperial rulers, but it didn't actually always match up with the facts. I mean, and female education is a great example, because the British talked about, the need for female education in India, but they really didn't spend much money on it themselves. In Bombay, at least, they spent a few £100s on funding female education. And it was the Indians who actually were the ones who provided thousands and thousands of rupees for that particular effort. So, there were certain ideas definitely that were transmitted through colonialism that benefited the country. But colonial rule as that agent of change oftentimes was more fiction than fact.
So this idea of the drain of wealth and how India, the jewel in the British crown was being the riches of India were being sucked to empower and enrich another country. In that case, then why does he stand for Parliament in 1892?
A good question. So in this era, it is very, and we're talking about the 1880s, 1890s. If you are in India and you're trying to start a political movement against colonial rule, or at least against aspects of colonial rule, chances are you'd be shot down very quickly, right? Because Indians were extremely poor. There was very little civic fabric with which to work. And the British had on their side very strong sedition laws and laws against, speaking out against particular aspects, press restriction laws. So ultimately, people like Naoroji realized that the affairs of India were controlled in London, right? The people who were controlling the strings of power were situated in London as well as in Calcutta. But in London, at least, there were some people who were more sympathetic towards Indian political demands. And there were definitely many British MPs who were, strong supporters of political reform. So if you went to Great Britain, you kind of went to the head of the beast, if you will, right? And over there, you could potentially change things on the ground through speaking up in Parliament, through trying to convince ordinary British people that colonialism was doing bad things to India.
So, and you have a chapter in your book called Turning Towards Westminster, when he wins his election in 1892. And this is actually a really lovely nugget where you say he wins very narrowly by 5 votes. And I think there's a sort of little joke about that, and it's Dadabhai Naoroji, and he wins so narrowly. But he does turn towards Westminster. And when he's in the heart, and then there's this other very interesting chapter, which I found very interesting, was an Indian in the heart of empire. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about this sort of collision between Dadabhai Naoroji and the empire.
Sure. Well, I mean, he lived through it every day, right? When he was in London, he took his family and everybody with him. Did he? Not always, no. So for a majority of the time, his family, his wife, his 2 daughters and sons stayed in Bombay. There was a period of time when his son especially stayed with him in London, but for a large period of time, they were separate. And Naoroji really evolves in this period of time when he's living in London as the head of the Indian community in Great Britain. At this point in time, there are a few hundred Indians, maybe a little bit more if you account for people who are coming and going as seafarers and such. But the community is not very big. And this is an era when, cultural isolation, racism, etc., would have been felt even more profoundly than anything we can imagine today, right? So Naoroji really helped he helped Indians who had come to Great Britain find their way. I mean, he encouraged them in his studies. He connected them with British people who were friendly towards Indians and who would help them in their career. He gave them a lot of financial support. I mean, when you go through the archives, you discover all these checks that he gave as loans or, financial support to students or individuals who are struggling. So he played an important community role also, which is why I think he's very important for Great Britain also, because, he's, again, at the creation of the modern Asian community. Would he have met Gandhi and other Indians who came along in London? Right. So it's a little uncertain about whether Naoroji and Gandhi met each other face-to-face for very long when Gandhi was there as a law student in the late 1880s and early 1890s. But they definitely communicated while Gandhi was in South Africa. There are many letters, and Gandhi wrote a letter to Naoroji in 1894 saying, look, I'm in South Africa. I'm trying to mobilize Indian support for reversing all this discrimination we're facing. Can you help guide me like a father would guide a son? And the two remain in contact for the remainder of Naoroji's life, at least. When Gandhi comes back to India in 1915, one of the first people he meets is Naoroji. And Naoroji is, by this point in time, just a few years away from his death. He's in his mid to late 80s. So, he was an important figure in Gandhi's life as well. Now, that's really interesting because apart from Naoroji, Gokhale, of course, was a very important and influential figure in Gandhi's life, and he dies very early too. But right. Just to come back to Naoroji's life, so he is elected to Parliament. He serves in the British Parliament, and then he gets disillusioned by it. What happened? Right. So he serves a very short period of time in Parliament, 3 years. And by the time his 3rd year rolls around, he's already realizing that most people aren't listening to him, and most people don't care.
Why not? Anything,
India is just not an important concern. Whenever the Indian budget would be debated within the parliament, the joke was that all the MPs filed out of the room. They weren't interested in it. India was important as a place where you could make money as a British person, but most MPs were not concerned about it. Right? And it wasn't a topic of interest. It wasn't their home country, of course. So he gets very disillusioned while in Parliament, and he becomes even more outspoken. Towards the end of his time in Parliament, in reply to the Queen's speech, which is an important moment in Parliament, he compares the fate of Indians to those of slaves in America. And, you're saying this in Parliament, right? I mean, this causes a little bit of outrage. But again, the fact that no one is listening to him really seriously, apart from a few of his friends, convinces him that, this method of lobbying through Parliament wasn't enough. You had to do more than that. And that, of course, was a realization that others like Gandhi and Tilak and all built upon. Naoroji did not go as far as them, of course, but he kind of, again, laid the foundation by saying, look, we just need to make allies with as many people as possible, socialists, the Irish, American anti-imperialists, other anti-imperialists in other colonies, and through that kind of get a groundswell against this colonial juggernaut.
So by the time he goes to Parliament as an MP in 1892, he has already co-founded the Indian National Congress in 1886. So, about 6 years later, right? Mm-hmm. And then he comes back. So give us a flavor of what's happening in India.
So the Congress is founded in December 1885, and it's founded at a moment of optimism, at least politically, because India has just, in India, Lord Ripon had just retired as being the Viceroy of India. And to Indians, at least, he was like a breath of fresh air. I mean, he was in favor of many reformist efforts. He supported things like local self-government, which was giving power to municipalities, like, say, the BMC or the Delhi Municipal, those equivalents, Delhi Municipal Corporation, etc. So there was a moment of optimism, but it is very quickly vanquished because after Ripon, many of the viceroys who come in power are deeply conservative, and the British government itself, after 1895, is controlled by the conservatives, and they take a very, very hard line toward Indian policy and towards organizations like the Congress. Ripon's successor, Lord Dufferin, started out as a supporter of the Congress and ended his term condemning it. So there's a very small spark of hope that's quickly followed by a moment of desperation, and it only gets worse as time goes along. By 1895, 1896, there's famine in Western India, Northern India. There's a plague epidemic, and the British are using very hard-handed tactics to deal with the plague. And with the famine, millions of people are dying who did not need to die, right? I mean, the policies in place were not robust enough to prevent a lot of unnecessary deaths.
So when does the whole idea of Swaraj come into being?
It comes in phases. The first time he talks about self-government for India publicly is 1884. So very early, even though, the idea had been germinating in his mind for a long time. But, that's the first time where publicly he's saying self-government is our goal. But he kind of backpedals, publicly at least, because he's running for parliament. And of course, if you stand for parliament and say you want self-government for India, you're probably not going to be very popular, right? But after he loses his election to parliament in 1895 and during the next few years of radicalization, then again he starts publicly talking about self-government. And at first, it still is a little cautious. He's talking about self-government under British paramountcy, what he calls British paramountcy. So therefore, India would be like Canada or Australia. You're in the British Empire, but you have self-government. But by 1906, by the time he gives his last Congress speech in Calcutta, he makes an important qualification. He says self-government or Swaraj can be like Australia or Canada, or it can be like the United Kingdom, which is a self-governing country in its own right.
And the division of Bengal has just taken place 1 year before. Correct,
yeah. And he was, of course, very opposed to this. He was happy that partition unleashed this popular ferment. He remarks to a friend of his, he's happy to be alive to see the birth of the real birth of Indian nationalism on a popular register.
So the last 20 years of his life, you say he returns to India in 1895, 96, and 20 years later he passes away. So the last 20 years are full of ferment in a sense.
Correct, yeah. So, immediately after his loss in Parliament, he's actually still in the United Kingdom. But, in some ways that's good for him because a lot of the activities he did there, he would not be able to really do in India, right? I mean, reach out to, say, socialists, members of the Labour Party who eventually would support India to a great degree, reaching out to anti-imperialists, writing in a very forceful manner.
International, he's a part of the Second International with Kautsky. I saw that.
Correct. Yeah. So he's, Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Henry Hinman, all these people he either meets or he talks to. And so again, here, while he's away from India, he's still laying a foundation, which later people like, say, Lala Lajpat Rai or Krishna Menon, and eventually people like Nehru and Gandhi will use in order to buoy the Indian nationalist movement. All these allies around the world who can help you.
So tell me a little bit about Naoroji's sort of, when he returns home, how does, say people with like Tilak, who are sort of more right-wing than centrist people like himself, how does he deal with them?
So Naoroji occupied a unique position towards the end of his life. The moderates in the Congress thought that he was too extremist, and the extremists thought he was too moderate. So his relations with Tilak seemed very civil. I mean, there are only a few letters that survive between them. But, in the letters, Tilak shows a great deal of respect towards Naoroji. And even though no correspondence the other way survives, I assume it must be the same way. So Tilak strenuously urged Naoroji to adopt more radical tactics. He says, look, you can't keep on petitioning, you can't keep on doing these constitutional methods, you have to use other methods, national education, boycott, strike. And it was very hard for Naoroji to accept that. I mean, he endorsed Swadeshi, but it was difficult for him to accept tactics that he saw as being extra-legal. Tilak, for his part, even though he criticized Naoroji, and others criticized him far more than Tilak, I mean, others like Shyamji Krishna Varma, he was pleased at Naoroji's last speech to the Congress in 1906. He said, ultimately, this helps us, the extremists, and it shows us the way forward. I mean, he gives a famous speech in College Square in Calcutta in early 1907, where he says...
Who does? Tilak does?
Tilak does, yeah, Tilak. And he says, those of us who are younger have a right to draw our own conclusions from Naoroji's experience. And the conclusion we draw is that, we try to get, through constitutional means, to get certain things from the British. They didn't work very well. So we should evolve a step further and take the struggle to a different level.
So what about Shyamji Krishna Varma? You just mentioned that they had met. What was their relationship like? Right.
So Krishna Varma was an interesting character. He was Diwan and a princely official in Gujarat and places like Junagadh for many years. Then he goes to Oxford and he becomes enamored with the thought and philosophy of Herbert Spencer. And eventually, by the very early 1900s, he becomes a radical Indian nationalist based in London. And he runs this newspaper called the Indian Sociologist that's run out of London and eventually Paris. And he becomes the most vocal critic of Naoroji. He says Naoroji is just too moderate. You need to support people like Tilak instead. Naoroji is too old. He needs to retire and let a younger generation take up the battle. So when Naoroji is nominated as the president of the Congress in 1906, he goes out after him. And he says, this is not what needs to happen.
Shyamji Krishna Varma does that.
Correct. Yeah.
And he doesn't agree with the nomination of him as president of the National Congress.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, he supports Tilak for that position. Krishna Varma is the most stringent critic of Naoroji at this point in time.
So do they come around? Do they have, is there a happy compromise sometime later?
None that I know of. I mean, I know, for example, that Naoroji went to India House in 1906 when it was inaugurated. And India House was the place which Shyamji Krishna Varma set up, where Savarkar and other revolutionaries lived. So, I mean, they knew one another, and they were probably on friendly terms prior to this state of disagreement. But I found no evidence of any sort of rapprochement afterward. And Shyamji Krishna Varma, I should mention, is quickly kind of self-exiled to Paris. So he leaves London by 1907, 1908.
And then you have Gokhale, which is the other major figure on the Indian national scene at the time, a mentor in many ways to Gandhi, if you like. What about him?
Right. So Gokhale was someone who everyone had great hopes for. I mean, Ranade, Naoroji, Dutt, all of these people. So they really tried to kind of nurture his potential. Again, by the end of his political career, Naoroji is thinking that Gokhale is too moderate. Gokhale was the president of the Congress the year before Naoroji was president in 1906. So Gokhale was president in Banaras in 1905. And Naoroji actually tries to get him to say, support self-government. And Gokhale talks about self-government, but he kind of tiptoes around it. So Naoroji is constantly trying to push him in a more radical direction. And he does this quite beautifully in 1906. He's too old to read his speech at the Calcutta Congress. He's 81 years old. So what does he do? He gives it to Gokhale to read. And therefore, he puts his own words in Gokhale's mouth. And Gokhale is kind of bound to this idea of self-government consequently.
That's really fascinating. So he sort of straddles both eras, if you like. On the one hand, the era that comes after him, after he passes, and the moderates around him.
Correct. Yeah.
So now that, what is the message of Naoroji's life, would you say?
I think there are a few messages. I mean, one, I've written an article recently on this for BBC, perseverance. Naoroji faced such terrible odds throughout his life. It was a life of constant disappointment, of constantly campaigning for something and not getting it. But he never really gave up. He never really gave up hope. He never really gave up fighting. And he said, he told the Congress, you have to persevere. You cannot give up, no matter what befalls you. And the other, I think, really important thing about Naoroji is this embrace of certain liberal ideas. And the fact that he helped make them so foundational towards modern India. Freedom of the press, freedom of expression, a responsible government with, some, allegiance to democratic semblances. These are questions which we're all confronting right now, right? Whether it be India, the United States, other parts of the world. So legacies of people like him, I think, are really important to remember at this point of time.
So Dinyar, I didn't ask you about another important figure on the Indian national scene at the time, Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
Yes.
The two met and they knew each other.
Right. So Jinnah claimed that he had a much closer relationship with Naoroji than I think what actually existed. So
how did you come to that conclusion?
Right. So if you read what Jinnah says, or at least what his biographers say, Jinnah was kind of one of his, Jinnah was inspired by Naoroji. He served as a secretary to Naoroji, probably during the 1906 Calcutta Congress. He helped campaign for Naoroji during his parliamentary career. I could find very little evidence of any of this. I found all of one reference to Jinnah in the Naoroji papers. So in the 15,000 documents I encountered while working on Naoroji and his papers, I found only one reference in one letter.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So, I don't think, Naoroji probably, he knew of Jinnah, no doubt, but I don't think the two were terribly close in any way or form.
So he wasn't his secretary during the 1906 Congress?
He might have been, but a person like Naoroji had numerous secretaries. There were lots of people working for him. So he might have served in some capacity, but I've never found the official designation over there.
Right. So as we come to a conclusion of this discussion, and I would like to exhort all the viewers of this program, not just to read the book, but also to think about the issues that surround us today. And several of them, would you say, Dinyar, are also common. And I'd like to just actually ask you about what's happening in Britain today with the felling of the statues, of people pulling down statues, and the big controversy over Churchill. And
right.
While this is not directly connected with your book, but because you're a historian, I just wanted to ask you, does the past require this kind of harsh treatment?
Well, there's a historian in Great Britain called Miles Taylor, and he recently brought up an important point. Statues have constantly been knocked down. Think of the French Revolution. Things similarly have happened in Great Britain where statues of older generations of people have been knocked down. So, there's a precedent for this. This is not entirely new. At the same time, I think a really important lesson from history is that, again, as I mentioned, things are neither black or white. Only a very few number of people can be classified as fully good or fully bad, right? Churchill is a great example of someone who was very important to British history, arguably, right? He played an undeniable role in World War II for Great Britain, but he had terrible legacies in other parts of the world, right? Like India or places like Kenya, or his role in World War I with a naval debacle in Gallipoli. So, tearing down statues of people like him is a difficult thing. I am in the camp that thinks that some of the, some guys definitely need to go. Absolutely. Especially what's going on in America with getting rid of Confederate statues. Those were put up for an explicit political purpose of putting down a class of people, right? But for people like Churchill and others, it's best to kind of develop a more nuanced understanding and understand that people are not heroes, right? People are complex and flawed, and they've done good and bad. And, enough attention needs to be given to the bad they've done as to the good that people like Churchill have done as well.
So the reason I'm also asking you is that, we have all these figures in our history, and Naoroji is one of them. In Delhi, we have this government colony where bureaucrats live called Naoroji Nagar. And I'm sure that poor Naoroji's sort of name is sort of littered across parts of the Indian countryside, definitely, and maybe there's something in the UK as well. But this would you say that there is an indifference to our history, to our historical figures like him?
Absolutely. So I've never been a fan of this culture of renaming roads or even, for that matter, putting up statues in the first place. I think those are terrible monuments for any individual. What good is it to name a road after Mahatma Gandhi when, the road becomes MG, right? I mean,
But you have to give the road some name. So it may as well be Mahatma Gandhi or Naoroji Nagar or, Naoroji Marg or something.
Perhaps, but in so many cases, and think of MG Road in Delhi. That's, Gandhi would be aghast to, have his name associated with it. I think it's much better to establish institutions or, pieces of legislation, for example, that embody the spirit of particular people. So, for Naoroji, the perfect monument for someone like Naoroji would be an educational institution, whether it be for disadvantaged children at the primary and secondary level, or something that really brings in, disadvantaged people for higher education. That would be an excellent example of a monument for him. Living monuments rather than things that we drive over or statues that pigeons sit on top. I think those are terrible legacies in many ways.
Dinyar Patel, thank you so much for your time, for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
This collaboration between ThePrint and Harper Collins, representing Harvard University Press, which has published your book. And this is a new collaboration that we have at ThePrint called SoftCover, where we publish authors like yourself in this pandemic, because there's no way that people are going to go to a hall and meet you. I don't know if you're getting out, but Delhi is still quite being very careful.
No, in Mumbai, we're firmly entrenched indoors. So we haven't left our compound since late April. So no moving out, unfortunately. But I really appreciate ThePrint having this soft copy opening for me.
So here it is, ladies and gentlemen, go out and get your book, or actually, since you can't go out, order it online. Dinyar Patel's Naoroji. Thank you again for this, Dinyar, and our collaboration is called SoftCover, so we hope that you will read us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and generally follow ThePrint and tell us what you think about it.